The day I married Elias Vane, I wore a gown the color of the deepest ocean trenches, and spent the entire ceremony convincing myself that none of it mattered. Not the vows, not the crowd, and certainly not the human standing beside me. The marriage was a political arrangement, nothing more. At least, that was what I told myself. I had received exactly 3 days' notice. 3 days to prepare for what was, without question, the most humiliating diplomatic assignment ever given to a daughter of House Voraki. My mother delivered the news the way she delivered everything unpleasant. Calmly, efficiently, without leaving room for discussion. She stood in the center of our receiving chamber, her bioluminescent markings completely dark along her neck and temples, a sign that she had already accepted the decision and expected me to do the same. "You will represent the Voraki name with dignity," she said. Her voice never wavered. "You will conduct yourself as generations before you have conducted themselves." A pause, then the final blow. "You will do this for the Empire, not for yourself, not for happiness, not for love, for the Empire." That was always the answer. In our family, duty came first, and questions came last. Sometimes they never came at all. I didn't argue. There was no point. Instead, I walked to the water gardens behind the embassy complex and sat beside the reflecting pools for hours, watching pale light ripple across the surface. I practiced feeling nothing. Fortunately, I had years of experience. I began practicing emotional detachment when I was 14 years old and assigned to my first diplomatic posting. By now, it was practically an art form. While other diplomats learned negotiation strategies, I learned how to smile while burying disappointment, how to bow while swallowing anger, how to obey without showing resentment. It was arguably my most valuable professional skill. The human had arrived on Meridian Conclave Station 6 weeks earlier. That alone had caused endless gossip. Humans were still relatively new to galactic politics. Most species viewed them as ambitious newcomers, clever, adaptable, occasionally reckless, but ultimately insignificant compared to the ancient powers of the galaxy. The official reports described Elias Vane as completely unremarkable. Former military officer. Current diplomatic representative. No noble lineage. No political dynasty. No extraordinary achievements. Just a human. Ordinary. Forgettable. Safe. Which was precisely why the conclave approved the match. No one expected a human to disrupt centuries of carefully balanced politics. No one expected a human to become important. No one expected a human to change anything. The first time I saw Elias, standing across the wedding platform beneath the crystal lights of the conclave hall, my initial reaction was disappointment. My second reaction was annoyance. Because he didn't look intimidated. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't overwhelmed by the importance of the occasion. While ambassadors, nobles, and dignitaries filled the chamber around us, Elias Vane simply stood there as if he belonged, calm, relaxed, almost amused. I remember thinking that he lacked the proper respect for the moment. I remember thinking that marrying him would be a burden I would simply endure. I remember thinking that within a year, I would barely notice his presence. Looking back now, those thoughts seem almost funny. Because less than 2 years later, half the galaxy would whisper his name with equal parts awe and fear. Entire fleets would change course when they learned he was involved. Ancient warlords would refuse negotiations unless he was present. And civilizations that had existed for thousands of years would call him something no human had ever been called before. A war deity. But on that day he was just my husband. A quiet human standing beside me beneath a sea of lights. And I was far too blind to realize that history had just walked into my life wearing a diplomatic uniform. I had not paid him much attention in those 6 weeks. Why would I? Humanity was a new species on the galactic stage. They had achieved faster-than-light travel approximately 2 centuries ago, which measured against the elder species of the conclave, made them something between an infant and a promising young student, who had not yet demonstrated whether the promise was real. They had observer status. They attended sessions. They asked questions that were sometimes obvious and sometimes strangely precise. And they brought food into meeting chambers, where food was expressly not permitted. And they shook hands with everyone they met, which was a peculiarly intimate gesture for a diplomatic environment. And they were collectively exhausting in the way that any newcomer is exhausting when they have not yet learned to be invisible. I had formed my assessment of them in the first 2 weeks. Young species, energetic, technologically capable, but not sophisticated in the ways that mattered. The kind of people who would, in another century or two, develop into genuinely useful members of the galactic community, but for now peripheral. And then the Conclave decided that the new peace framework with Earth's colonial expansion authority required a symbolic bond, a marriage. One Conclave diplomat to one human representative. A gesture of shared future, a demonstration of trust between the elder community and the newest addition to the great conversation. They chose me. I later found out that Elias Vane had been informed 4 hours before I was. I never asked what he did with those 4 hours. I spent mine in the water garden, working on feeling nothing, and by the time I had to stand up and go inside and begin preparing, I had achieved something close to it. Not nothing exactly, more like a very controlled quiet. The kind you can maintain indefinitely, as long as you do not let anything touch it. The ceremony was 30 minutes. Standard conclave, formal bonding, 7 officials, 2 archivists, no extended family, because neither of us had family on station, and a receiving room that had been decorated with neutral colors and flowers native to no particular species, so as not to imply cultural favoritism. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic blandness, which I appreciated. Elias stood on my left in his dress uniform, dark navy, silver trim of the collar for service decorations that I did not yet know the history of. He was not quite as tall as the human males I had observed in sessions. He had brown hair, worn slightly longer than regulation on the sides, in a way that suggested he had simply not gotten around to cutting it, and a face that was straightforward and unremarkable except for his eyes, which were the color of old bark. Not quite brown, not quite anything else. The color of something that had been outdoors for a long time. He was completely still during the ceremony. I had expected fidgeting, woman's fidget. I had observed this in sessions, the small restless movements they made when they were uncomfortable, or bored, or uncertain. Elias was not fidgeting. He was standing the way someone stands when they have made a decision and are simply waiting for the external events to catch up to the internal one. When the officiator reached the part requiring both parties to acknowledge the bond, Elias turned to look at me, and he did not do what men in political arrangements typically do, which is a quick cataloging look, a brief visual inventory to confirm that the other person is present and acceptable, and then a redirection of attention back to something more interesting. He actually looked at me like I was something that had his full and genuine attention, like he was curious. I found it deeply irritating. The reception after was small. I stood near the window on the far side of the room and ate almost nothing, and accepted polite congratulations from people I knew professionally, and answered all their questions in the correct register, and observed the room the way I always observed rooms. It was what I did. I cataloged. I noted. I filed. I noted that Elias moved through the room with ease. He spoke to everyone who approached him. He laughed once, genuinely, at something a junior Kafari said, and the laugh was not diplomatic. It was just a laugh, the real kind. The kind that means you actually found something funny. He accepted a glass of amber human alcohol from a server and sipped it slowly, and did not pretend it was anything other than what it was. He did not perform comfort. He simply appeared to be comfortable. Across the room, I noticed Vorsi. He was a junior diplomat from the Sodomy delegation, a young male who had made it a small and private hobby to make comments about me in my native tongue when he calculated I was out of range. He had been doing it for months. I was always in range. I had exceptional hearing, but correcting him publicly would have cost more in political friction than it was worth. So I've been filing his comments and letting them accumulate toward a moment when they would be useful. He said something to the Sadani aide standing beside him in Vor-Ias, my native language, spoken in the lower register, that he believed was inaudible at this distance. He said she looks like she swallowed a piece of furniture. Imagine spending the next diplomatic cycle attached to a human. They probably talk during meals. I kept my expression exactly where it was. I have been keeping my expression exactly where I wanted it for 23 years. Vorsi was not a challenge. But beside me, and I had not noticed Elias across the room, which was itself notable because I noticed most things. There was a small sound, barely a sound, more like something that had almost become a laugh, and then out of some private courtesy, decided to remain inside. I turned and looked at him directly. "Did you understand what he said?" I asked. Elias was looking at his glass. There was a movement at the very corner of his mouth. Not a smile, and not a smile. Something careful, and slightly amused, and contained. "I understand most things," he said. "People just assume I don't." He did not explain further. He looked back at the room. He appeared to find the nebula visible through the reception window genuinely interesting. He did not elaborate on what he understood, or how, or when, he had learned to understand it. He simply looked at the nebula, and held his glass, and stood there in the settled quiet of someone who was not waiting for anything. I filed this. I filed it under a category I had not previously needed, which I labeled in my mind simply as reconsider. Later, when the last guest had left, and we were alone in our shared diplomatic quarter for the first time, I asked him directly. I wanted the scope of it. I wanted to know how much of what he appeared to be was real. "What exactly did Varesi say?" I said, word for word. "I want to know the accuracy of your comprehension." Elias set his glass down. He repeated what Varesi had said in full actus, register with the precise tonal inflection that distinguishes meaning in my language. An inflection that takes most non-native speakers a decade to approach, and almost never produces correctly. I looked at him for a long moment. "When did you learn Varakis?" I asked before I came here. He said it is one of the most structurally complex languages in conclave records. The tonal register alone takes years to calibrate. Most of the elder species do not fully achieve it. "I know," he said, and then simply easily, with no performance attached to it. "I like difficult things." He said goodnight. He went to his room. The door closed quietly. I stood in the center of our shared quarters and looked at the space he had just left for what I suspect was a long time. Long enough that the station lighting had shifted a degree toward its evening cycle before I moved. I thought about my mother's words. I thought about the 3 days of preparation and the 30-minute ceremony, and the carefully controlled quiet I had built around myself to get through both. And I thought for the first time since this had all begun, in the voice of my grandmother rather than my mother, "The stone you dismiss is often the one the river has been shaping the longest." I went to my desk. I opened a new notes file. I started writing. 41 days into our arrangement, the notes were 12 pages long. They were not personal notes. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to how I understood them at the time. They were professional assessments, diplomatic observations, the kind I kept on every significant figure I encountered. Structured records of behavior, pattern, motivation, capability, and likely trajectory. I had files like this on 47 conclave representatives and attaches on 6 heads of state, on 3 conclave committee chairs, and on my own mother, who had been the most diplomatically complex person in my professional life until 42 days ago. The notes on Elias's vein were 12 pages and growing. He was doing something in the conclave sessions, something subtle and continuous, and almost invisible if you were not watching for it. Every delegate in those sessions was doing something, managing an agenda, protecting a position, building an alliance, maintaining a posture. That was the background noise of diplomatic work, the constant low hum of strategic movement. What Elias was doing was different. He was listening. Not the diplomatic version of listening, which is really just waiting. Not the performative listening you do when you want someone to feel heard while you compose your next argument. He listened the way a person listens when they genuinely do not yet know what they think, and they need all available information before they form an opinion. He sat in the third observer row. Humanity did not yet have a full seat, and he was so still and so quiet that senior delegates sometimes looked over their shoulders mid-session as if they had just remembered something and were startled to find him there. He never asked more than one question per session. One question always delivered without urgency, almost as an afterthought in the light and slightly apologetic tone that humans used when they wanted to seem non-threatening. And every single time that one question would land on the exact place the entire session had been carefully navigating around the place, no one wanted to name directly, because naming it directly would require committing to a position. He would name it quietly with full innocence, and the room would shift. I tracked 11 instances of this across my first 41 days of observation. I noted something else. He never reacted first in sessions that became heated, and conclave sessions could become extraordinary in their intensity. Thousands of years of political memory colliding in a single chamber over a single disputed clause. Elias was always the last person to visibly respond, not because he was slow. I stopped believing that in the first week, because he was watching the responses of everyone else first, filing them, and then producing a response that had already accounted for everything he had just seen. He was running a calculation that most people did not know was running. On the 43rd day, the conclave received the first formal intelligence report on the Vreth Dominion. The Breath had been mentioned in passing in corridor conversations for the past few months. They were an expanding empire in the Outer Rim, a conquest-focused civilization that have been steadily absorbing smaller systems for 2 generations. Their method was consistent. Send terms first, attack second. Leave nothing functional if the terms were declined. It was an effective philosophy. It was patient and methodical, and they had used it to take 11 systems in 14 years. Until this report, they had maintained careful distance from anything with conclave membership. The distance had looked like respect. The report suggested it had been strategy. 3 Outer Rim systems had gone silent in the past 8 months. Small populations, no conclave membership, minimal defense infrastructure. The kind of silence that follows a very loud event and then stays, because there is no one left to break it. The conclave session on this matter lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. I sat at the Varaki's table and listened to every word. The conclusions were familiar. A monitoring committee would be established. A formal inquiry would be dispatched. The situation would be observed with appropriate attention and caution. Intervention carried its own costs, and the territories in question were unregistered, which meant the conclave had no formal obligation, and therefore, by the logic that governed elder species decision-making, no immediate requirement to act. It was the correct logic. I believed at the time I had been trained in it. I had practiced it. It was responsible and considered, and based on a framework developed over centuries of managing exactly these kinds of situations. I voted in alignment with the Voraki's position, which was consistent with the conclave consensus, which was observed first. After the session, I found Elias in the wide corridor outside the main chamber. He was standing near the window wall, looking out at the space beyond the station. He stood like he always stood when he was thinking, still slightly forward, like he was leaning very gently toward whatever he was looking at. "What will the conclave do?" he asked before I reached him, which meant he had heard me coming and identified my footstep pattern, which should not have been possible over the ambient noise of a busy diplomatic station corridor post-session hour, and I noted it. "Observe," I said. "Form a monitoring committee. Send inquiry to the Outer Rim posts." He was quiet for a moment. "The kind of quiet that is not empty, and the 3 systems that went dark," he said. "Unregistered territories." I said no. "Right." He nodded one slow movement. I watched the line of his jaw tighten briefly. The specific tightening of someone who has composed a response, and then chosen silence over it. I had seen it before in people who were angry or frustrated. On Elias, it looked different. It looked like someone filing something. "Is there a human presence in those systems?" I asked, because something in the architecture of his stillness made me ask. "Small settlements," he said. 3 colonies. They went out on their own before the expansion protocols were formalized. Not officially registered." He paused. "They're still our people," he said. "The way someone states a simple fact. Not with anger, not with performance. Just with the calm certainty of a person for whom the statement required no explanation. The way you state that water is wet, or that distance exists. It was simply true, and it defined without further words the entire frame within which he was processing the session we had just sat through." He turned from a window and looked at me. Those old bark eyes, that patient cataloging attention. I saw something in them I did not have a word for in any of the 6 languages I spoke. I had to search later through human language databases to find the nearest match. The word was resolve, but it was a particular kind of resolve, the kind that is not new, the kind that has been there for a long time and is simply now required. He said goodnight. He walked back toward the embassy quarters, at a pace that was slightly faster than his usual pace, and I stood at the window after he had gone and looked at the space he had been looking at, as if the answer to something might still be visible in it. I did not sleep that night, or the next, or the one after. On the 47th day, I did something I had not done since my first year of training, when my instructor had told us that the most reliable way to understand any entity was to study what they had already done. Not what they said, not what they projected, what they had actually done in the historical record where the outcomes were already visible. I accessed the human historical database. I started with their wars, because wars always told me the most. Wars showed a species what they were willing to pay for, what they would trade comfort for, what they believed was worth destruction, and what they let go. Wars were the most honest documents a civilization produced, because they could not be curated afterward. The record existed in too many places, carried by too many survivors. I expected a short and incomplete record. A young species, some territorial conflicts in their early expansion period, gradual organization, the standard development arc I had seen in the files of every species that had eventually come to the conclave table. I read for 11 hours. I finished at 3 o'clock in the morning, station time, sitting in my chair with my hands in my lap and my notes untouched, because I had stopped taking notes somewhere an hour, when the notes began to feel inadequate. Humans had been at war in some combination or another for nearly every year of their recorded history, not isolated conflicts with recovery periods between, rolling, overlapping, generation-spanning wars that should have broken them irreparably, that had broken other species irreparably when they faced a fraction of the accumulated damage, plagues that killed a third of their population in a single decade, natural disasters that erased regions of their civilization, political collapses that undid centuries of accumulated progress. And then, and this was the part one, sat within the quiet of early morning, turning it over and over in my mind. They rebuilt, not to their previous state. That was the detail that the summary reports did not properly convey, the detail that required reading the actual historical record to see. They did not recover their previous shape. They recovered a new shape every time, one that was structurally adapted to whatever had just damaged them. The plague killed a third of their population, and the civilization that rose from it had medical science and public health infrastructure that had never existed before. The political collapse ended 300 years of a specific kind of corruption, and the government that emerged from it had reforms that had never been achievable while the old system stood. They were not built to survive damage. Something built to survive damage endures it and continues. They were built differently. They learned from damage. They absorbed it and converted it into the next version of themselves. I found a phrase in their military doctrine files, public access, openly posted, which said something about how humans related to information that stopped me. Never plan for the last war. It was a principle, a governing philosophy of their military development. It meant that whenever they found a strategy that worked, they immediately began designing the strategy that would defeat that strategy, so they would be prepared when someone else arrived at the same solution. They created adversarial units whose entire function was to find every weakness in their own defenses before an enemy discovered them. They had been doing this for 200 years in space. Before that, they had been doing it for centuries on their own world. I closed the database. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about Elias standing at the window saying, "There still are people," in that quiet, factual voice. I thought about the 3 silent systems on the edge of WH space, and I thought for the first time with a clarity so clean, it felt like cold water. Whatever the breath dominion thinks it is dealing with, it is wrong. More than that, more quietly, and more significantly than that, I thought I'd been wrong too. I got up. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee the way Elias had taught me without trying to teach me by leaving the instructions on a piece of paper beside the container every morning, until I no longer needed them. It was bitter and dark, and it made my thoughts settle into focus the way they needed to settle. I went back to my desk. I opened a new notes file. I started it differently than I had started all the others, not with professional assessment headers or diplomatic observation categories. I started it with a question. The question was, what does it mean that I have been watching this man for 47 days, and I have been systematically underestimating him? And what does that tell me about my assumptions? And what else have I been assuming that I should be examining more carefully? I wrote for a long time. When the station lighting shifted to morning cycle, I had 17 new pages of notes, and a feeling that I did not yet have a name for sitting in my chest that was somewhere between unsettled and awake. The message arrived at 0400 station time. It was from Elias, sent at 0347, which meant he had been awake before I was, which was not unusual. I had noticed over the past weeks that he often rose early during periods of heightened conclave activity, as though his mind engaged at a higher operational level, when the station was quiet and no one was demanding anything of it. I had noted this. I had noted most things about him by this point. The message was 8 sentences. I've notified Earth Command. I'll be gone 3 days. The filing codes for the secondary trade sessions are in the shared folder, under the marker you'll recognize from Tuesday's prep. The Keth Very Adish assistant will try to reschedule the bilateral session while I'm out. Please push back to next week at minimum. They need to think they earned that date. Do not let Voresi near the SETI table for the Environmental Accord Subcommittee. He will undo 3 weeks of positioning in one afternoon. The small items in the garden window need water every other day. I left coffee in the kitchen if you want to try it. It helps. I read it 3 times. Then I noticed the instructions on the counter. A folded slip of paper beside a sealed container. His handwriting. 2 spoons. Hot water not boiling. 3 minutes. It helps with the 0400 feeling. I made the coffee. I drank it standing in the kitchen at 0400 in the quiet, while the station hummed its ambient hum, and everyone else was asleep. He had notified Earth Command. He would be gone 3 days. In the outer rim, a breath fleet had been massing for weeks. Intelligence was thin but consistent. They were massing near the systems that had gone silent. Systems that contained, among other things, 3 human colonial settlements that were unregistered with the Conclave, and therefore outside the protection framework, and therefore, by the calculation that governed things here. Not our problem. Not the Conclave's problem. Still our people. I wanted my desk. Elias had not revoked my secondary clearance on the Joint Embassy Communications Relay. I did not know if this was an oversight or not, and I had over the past weeks developed a healthy uncertainty about what constituted an oversight for Elias Vane. I accessed the relay. I began to read. He was gone for 11 days. I want to describe what those 11 days were like from the inside. I want to describe what it is to sit at a desk in a diplomatic station while the feeds come in piece by piece, and you read them, and you reassemble what is happening from intercepts and after-action reports and communications logs, and the occasional direct transmission that made it through the relay delay, and you understand slowly, and then all at once, what is occurring in a system several hours of travel from where you were sitting. On day 1, Elias's 7 experimental human vessels arrived in the Outer Rim system. 7, against a breath fleet that had grown per intelligence count to 60 warships. I had attended 3 conclave military doctrine seminars in my career. The accepted mathematical threshold for a viable engagement without support, reinforcement with a maximum disadvantage of 3.1 at 7 to 60. The mathematics said something clear and consistent and unambiguous. I read the number. I read it again. I thought about the doctrine files. Never planned for the last war. I kept reading. The colonial defense force on the settlements was 400 soldiers. They had been holding a defensive perimeter for 6 days before Elias's fleet arrived, with equipment that was designed for frontier security rather than warfare. And supplies that were stretched in away supplies get stretched when a situation lasts significantly longer than anyone planned for. The first communication I found from inside the engagement area came from a colonial defense officer on the surface, relayed to the fleet. Her name was Petra Hale. She was a captain, 34 years old, stationed on the oldest of the 3 settlements, one that had been there for 60 years and had been built from nothing by the grandparents of people currently living in it. Her message said, "They came back. Command is here. Hold the line. They came back." Her voice in the recording was steady. It was the specific steadiness of someone who has stopped being afraid and shifted into something harder and clearer. I had heard that particular steadiness in one other context. Diplomats and sessions that had become genuinely dangerous when the fear had been processed, and what remained was purpose. She sounded like purpose. I kept reading. The Breath Fleet Standard Arc formation was well documented in Conclave intelligence files. They had developed it over 14 years of conquest, and refined it through 11 successful campaigns. It was a sweeping 3-dimensional arc, designed to divide any defensive force into segments and prevent coordinated response, creating isolated pockets that could be addressed individually before they could support each other. It was effective. It was highly effective. Every recorded engagement where it had been deployed had ended in breath success. On day 2 of the engagement, Elias's 7 vessels did not respond to the arc formation in any way that matched any defensive or offensive doctrine in the Conclave database. They went into it. I had to read the spatial coordinate logs 3 times because I kept constructing the wrong picture. I kept expecting a conventional response to appear somewhere in the data, a counter formation, or evasive maneuvering, or a withdrawal to reform its safer range. None of these appeared. The 7 human vessels moved in a pattern that I could only describe at first as irrational. The movements did not match any formation logic I had studied. They were irregular, unpredictable, constantly shifting like something alive that did not know what shape it was supposed to be. I read the Breath Fleet Commander internal communication, which had been intercepted, and was sitting in the relay log between 2 routine status reports, as though no one had thought to flag it. He said to his command staff, "Their movement pattern is irrational. We cannot predict the next coordinate. Adjust arc to compensate." The arc adjusted, and in adjusting it, created a gap, a specific gap in a specific location, for approximately 40 seconds. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about the phrase I had read in the doctrine files, the one I had returned to a dozen times since. Never planned for the last war. The irrational movement pattern was not irrational. It had been designed to make the breath formation do exactly one thing, in exactly one location, at exactly one moment, for the 40 seconds, that would be enough. I pulled up the engagement log for those 40 seconds. I read what happened in the gap. I sat with it for a long time. On day 4, Elias's flagship took significant damage. Primary propulsion destroyed. Weapon systems at 28%. 2 whole sections breached and sealed. By any operational doctrine I had ever studied, the next entry in that log should have been an extraction request. The next entry in that log was a boarding action authorization. He assembled 12 soldiers from his damaged vessel and launched them across open space toward the Breath command ship. The action was logged by the team's second-in-command, a young officer named Oliver Cross, 26 years old, stationed on a flagship for his first deep-range deployment. He wrote with the careful, deliberate precision of someone who has been trained to document accurately and is applying that training with full focus, because the alternative is to think about what he is doing, and he has decided that documentation is more useful right now. He noted the objective. He noted the route. He noted the point at which they entered the Breath command vessel through a maintenance access point that had been identified during the initial engagement. He noted Elias leading from the front. He noted that at a point during the securing of the command deck, the Breath commander attempted to destroy the primary navigation console to prevent capture, and that Elias had been close enough to physically prevent this, which he did. Oliver Cross noted this without commentary. He wrote it as fact. The fact was sufficient. They took the Verith command vessel intact. All 12 soldiers returned to the flagship. On day 7, the Verith fleet began to pull back. Not a full retreat. They still had numbers. They still had firepower. In raw mathematical terms, they still held significant advantage. But their formation movements had changed. I could see it in the positional data. They were no longer moving with the certainty that had characterized the first 3 days. They were moving carefully, precisely with the specific quality of care that belongs to someone who has stopped being sure of the outcome. Careful means afraid. I knew this. I've been trained to read it. In 600 years of conclave diplomatic and military records, the shift from confident movement to careful movement was the single most reliable indicator that a force had encountered something outside the parameters of what it had planned for. The Breath had planned for a lot of things. They had 14 years of conquest to plan from. They had not planned for Elias Vane, and 7 ships, and the specific category of person who leads 12 soldiers across open space onto an enemy command vessel from a disabled flagship. Because the mission is not done, and the people are still our people. On day 9, the 3 colonial settlements sent a transmission open channel, not encrypted. They could have sent it encrypted. They chose open. They chose it specifically so that everyone in range would receive it, including the Breath fleet, which by that point was already beginning its careful, uncertain movements. It was not a formal communication. It was not a message in any diplomatic sense. It was just sound, the kind that communities produce when they have survived something together and do not have a ceremony for it, and make one up in a moment. They were saying his name, not commander, not sir, not any designation from any rank structure, just his name. 400 soldiers and 3 settlement populations worth of voices in all their different pitches and registers saying Elias. I listened to the recording twice. I noted that my hands, which I had placed on the desk with their usual stillness, were not at that moment entirely still. I did not write about this in my notes. On day 11, the door to our shared quarters opened at 17:30 station time. I was standing at the window. I had not decided to stand at the window. I had been sitting at my desk, and then I was at the window, looking at the same deep space I had looked at on our wedding night, and I do not entirely remember moving. He came in quietly. He was in his duty gear, and he was tired in the deep way, the kind of tired that lives in the bones rather than behind the eyes. There was a bruise along the left side of his jaw, yellow, green, and old by now, days old. There was a new mark along his collarbone, visible above his collar, a clean, thin line that someone had treated correctly in the field. He was carrying something in his right hand. He crossed the room and set it on my desk without any ceremony. A metallic command insignia, specific design Dominion Fleet command level. I had seen images of them in intelligence files. I looked at it. "What does that mean?" I asked. He looked at it for a moment. "It means they'll think twice," he said. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something large has settled into them. "There were 60 of them," I said. "Yes," he said. "You went in anyway." He looked at me. Not the patient cataloging look. Something more direct. Something that had been decided long before this moment, and was not open to revision. "They were our people," he said. I had prepared something. I had been composing it for several days in the careful, organized part of my mind that always had a response ready. A measured statement about military mathematics and diplomatic authorization protocols and the extreme inadvisability of a conclave-adjacent representative engaging in active combat operations without conclave sanction. None of it was there. What was there instead was something I did not have a word for. In Fui's, in any language I spoke. I found it later, searching human text databases, at 2 in the morning, in a line from an old poem that said, "I did not know the size of you until you filled the horizon." I looked at the command insignia on my desk. I looked at the tired, marked, absolutely settled face of the man standing in my quarters. I said, "Good night." I went to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. The horizon. I thought the horizon is not where the world ends. It is where your sight ends. I have been looking at this wrong from the beginning, and I was only now starting to understand what I was actually looking at. They came with 240 ships. I have said that number to myself many times since. I have said in my native language, and in standard conclave formal, and in a human English, that I have been quietly studying for 6 weeks, in the same late-night hours I have been spending on everything else that was remaking my understanding of the world. 240 warships, purpose-built veteran crews, coordinated command structure, the pride of the Breath Dominion assembled, and directed at one target station, Kareth, with a conclave held its outer rim sessions, where I was, where Elias was. The attack was not a surprise precisely. The monitoring committee had been tracking increased Breath fleet movement for weeks. There had been reports, assessments, models. The committee's last formal session, 3 days before the alarm, had concluded that the probability of direct action against conclave-adjacent space was rising, but had not yet crossed the threshold that would warrant a defensive posture change. I had read that assessment. I had read it knowing, because I had been paying attention, that Elias had read it too. I had watched him in the corridor after the briefing was distributed. He had stood very still for a moment, and then asked the monitoring committee's logistics coordinator a single quiet question about the fuel consumption profile of the ships in the latest fleet movement data. The coordinator had answered. Elias had nodded and said thank you, and walked away. I had thought at the time, he knows something we are not computing. I thought about that moment again, when the alarm sounded. The Breath preliminary communication arrived 9 minutes before the fleet. It was a declaration of intent in standard galactic diplomatic register, which meant they were still performing the form of something they had already decided to abandon. It demanded immediate conclave recognition of Breath territorial claims across the full outer rim. It warned that any vessel departing the station would be considered a hostile act. It was signed by the Breath Dominion High Command, stamped and formal. The way you make something formal when you want the historical record to reflect that you gave warning. 9 minutes. I was in the secondary conference room when the alarm activated. I had enough time to gather my notes, send a brief communication to the Voraki's embassy primary, and follow the station emergency protocol to the shelter level, 3 floors below the main hub. I moved quickly and without panic, which was training, and I did not let myself think about the number until I was inside the shelter and the door had sealed and someone handed me a status tablet. 240 ships. Our combined shelter held 19 people, 4 senior conclave diplomats, including myself, 8 junior staffers and attaches. The Kavari tactical officer I had spoken to briefly at a post-session reception weeks ago, 6 others whose functions I did not know by sight, all of us looking at the emergency feeds from the external cameras with the controlled expressions of people who are managing something that their training did not quite cover. The feeds were 3 external cameras placed for monitoring purposes rather than tactical surveillance. They showed space around the station from 3 angles. They were enough. The VR fleet arrived in full extended formation. 240 vessels spreading across the space around Kithville in the sweeping arc pattern I had read about in intelligence files, except this arc was not designed for a battlefield. It was designed for a station. It surrounded it, enclosed. It made the mathematics very clear for anyone looking at the feeds. The elderly said, Hani diplomat, 2 seats to my left, said something quietly in his own language that I did not speak, but that I recognized as an invocation. Something old, something his grandmother's grandmother might have said. 42 minutes after the alarm, the first human vessel emerged from faster-than-light arrival. The shelter went very quiet. Another vessel, then 4 more, then a cluster of 12, arriving in a tight spread that resolve into formation within seconds of arrival, moving immediately into position, as if the position had been calculated and held in memory for weeks. More came. The Kathvari tactical officer beside me began to count under her breath. I counted silently beside her. She stopped at 61 and did not resume. 61 human vessels. The Satani diplomat stopped his invocation mid-phrase and simply watched. The Breath fleet had received a signal, 11 minutes before it crossed into the Carthel system. I would find this later in the post-battle relay logs. The signal had come from an encrypted human military channel, and it had said to the Vreth fleet commander, in a VH primary command dialect, "You should reconsider what happened in the Outer Rim was a warning. What happens here will be a lesson. You have time to choose." The VHT fleet commander had not responded. He had answered in the language he knew, which was formation and firepower. Elias had answered in his. The engagement lasted 12 hours, and I watched most of it through 3 small shelter cameras, and I'm going to tell you honestly that I did not fully understand what I was watching in real time. I had military training. I understood formation doctrine and engagement protocols and weapons discharge patterns and evasive maneuvering. I watched the feeds and I understood each individual thing that was happening in each frame. I could not hold the whole picture because the whole picture kept changing. The human fleet did not maintain formation. That was the first thing I noted in the first 20 minutes. They moved in clusters that split and reformed and split again, like something organic rather than organized. The Breath fleet had been built to fight an opponent with a shape it could analyze, predict, and address with its superior numbers. The human fleet refused to hold a shape long enough for any of that to apply. The Kathari tactical officer was watching with an expression I had never seen on a Kathvari face. Their species was not expressive by nature or by diplomatic convention. She looked like someone who had just watched a fundamental law of physics produce an unexpected result and was rapidly revising her understanding of physics. "They are above the critical threshold," she said, at hour 3 to the room, rather than anyone in particular. "Their losses have crossed the point at which doctrine requires withdrawal and regrouping." The shelter was quiet. Outside on the feeds, a damaged human vessel was closing distance on a breath-heavy cruiser rather than pulling away from it. "What are they doing?" someone asked. "Accelerating," she said. I watched the damaged vessel come alongside the breath cruiser at close range. I did not understand what I was seeing for a moment. Then the Kavari officer said they're in the cruiser's weapons blind spot. At that range, the cruiser cannot target them without significant risk of self-damage. "Is that a standard approach?" "No," she said, "because if the cruiser's captain accepts the self-damage cost and fires anyway, the smaller vessel is destroyed. The captain knows this. He will fire." The cruiser did not fire. She said nothing for a long moment. Then he chose not to. I would learn later what Elias had said to that captain on an open channel in the captain's own dialect, at the exact moment his vessel came alongside. He had said, "Your crew is young. You have one choice right now that you will not have again in 40 seconds. Make it wisely." The captain had made it. He was the first to surrender. Over the following hours, more followed. Not because the firepower exchange had shifted decisively. The Breath maintained numerical advantage for the first 9 hours. They were losing for a reason that had nothing to do with weapons count or formation positioning or any variable in the mathematical models the Conclave Monitoring Committee had been using. They were afraid. I had studied fear as a diplomatic and military tool for my entire career. I knew its signatures in fleet movement. The erosion of precision, the unconscious widening of formation spacing as ships create distance from the source, the rising frequency of communication between commanders as they seek reassurance from each other. I had read these signatures in historical records. I had never watched them develop in real time before. The Breath fleet showed every signature in sequence with the pace of a thing falling. Their fundamental assumption, the one the entire engagement had been built on, the one that had looked so certain from their side, had been this: at some point, the humans will behave the way every other opponent has behaved. At some point, they will compute the mathematics and respond to the result. The humans had computed the mathematics. They had a different equation. Their equation did not have a surrender variable. It had something else instead, something I did not have a clean word for, something I've had been circling around in my notes for weeks. It was not recklessness. Recklessness is the absence of calculation. What I was watching was the presence of a calculation whose final factor outweighed all other inputs. They kept coming because the people on those 3 settlements were still their people. That was the factor. That was what changed all the other math. At hour 11, the Breath formation broke. Not a strategic withdrawal, not a tactical reorganization. The formation broke the way a thing breaks, when the assumption holding it together turns out to have been wrong. Ships moved independently, some retreating, some still engaging. The coordination that had made them a formidable force, dissolving into the disorganized individual response of 60 separate commanders, making 60 separate decisions, with no collective framework to hold them together. The collective framework had been, we understand what we are fighting. They did not understand what they were fighting. 41 Vreth ships destroyed, 112 surrendered, the remainder in full scatter. It was the largest single military defeat in Breath Dominion history. I would know this from the formal records filed later. In a shelter in real time, I knew it the way you know something that has just rearranged the landscape. You can see that the landscape has changed, even if you have not yet had time to map the new version of it. The feeds went still at hour 12. The Kethvari tactical officer sat down. She had been standing for 12 hours. She sat down on the bench across from me and looked at her hands at her lap and said nothing. She kept saying nothing for a long time. The session convened the next morning. Emergency format, all available conclave representatives. The chamber holding a quality of silence I had never experienced in 11 years of diplomatic service. The kind of silence that means everyone present is trying to locate themselves in relation to something that does not fit into their previous map. The elder Kethvari representative, a man who had been in conclave service for 6 decades, who had negotiated 7 major interexes frameworks and had abstained on 17 membership induction votes in his tenure, sat at his table and looked at the center of the room for a long time before he spoke. He said, "We did not know what humans were. No one disagreed. No one added to it. It sat in the room alone, true and complete. And they touched my arm. I was the closest available person with official conclave human relational status. A formal assessment statement was required for the record. I stood. I gave my statement in full diplomatic register, the correct language, the correct tonal architecture, everything professionally required. I gathered my notes. I walked back to our quarters. I did not sit at my desk. I did not go to the window. I sat down on the floor, in the center of the room with my back against the wall, and I stayed there. I did not know exactly how long. The station lighting cycled twice. I was not thinking in the organized way I usually thought. I was doing something I had not done since I was very young, before diplomatic training had given me the filing system I used for everything significant that happened to me. I was simply feeling what I felt without processing it first, without directing it anywhere. It felt like setting down something heavy, not relief, the discovery that my arms could do something other than hold. The door opened. Elias came in quietly. He was still in his duty gear. The tiredness on him was the specific deep tiredness of several days of cost arriving in the body all at once. He saw me sitting on the floor. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not treat something that was not wrong as though it were wrong. He crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside me, his back against the same wall. We sat there. The station hummed its ambient hum. The light held its evening cycle quality. After a long time, I said, "I have been afraid of the wrong things my entire life." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone composing an answer. The quiet of someone who recognized what had been said and was giving it the space it deserved. "That's how it starts," he said. "What comes after?" I asked. "Usually," he said, "breakfast." I laughed. Not a diplomatic laugh, not a polite laugh, the controlled kind with appropriate timing that I had been producing in social context for 20 years. A real laugh. The kind that comes before you decide whether it is appropriate. The kind that is just there because something was genuinely funny and your body responded to it. He smiled. Not the small, careful one from diplomatic settings. Something more honest. Something that had been there all along and had simply been waiting for the right moment. We sat on the floor a while longer, and I thought quietly in a specific way. You think things when they have become clear. I have been in this room for months, and I have been reading it wrong the whole time. The Vereth Dominion opened formal ceasefire negotiations 8 weeks after Carthel. Their senior diplomatic representative, a minister named Vorhythe, arrived with a particular bearing of a person who has survived a significant loss and has chosen to move forward from it with full dignity and tact. I recognized the bearing. I had worn it myself on several occasions in my career, though never for reasons as large as his. I watched him cross the negotiation chamber toward the central table. I noted how he walked, how he held his hands, where his eyes went first when he entered the room. Reading arrival is one of the most important skills in diplomatic work. The first 30 seconds of presence tell you more than an hour of prepared statements. He was afraid of Elias, not visibly, not in any way that could be cited in a report, but I could see it. The small adjustment of trajectory that kept Vorhia on the far side of the table. The way his eyes moved to Elias first, and then away too quickly. The way you look at something that is brighter than you expected. The negotiations lasted 11 sessions over 4 weeks. I attended all of them. I had a seat now full accreditation. Voraki's representative to the Conclave Human Breath Joint Framework. I sat 2 positions to Elias's left, and I watched him work in a way I had been watching him work for months. Except now, I was watching with completely different eyes. He was patient through every session. He was fair. He gave nothing away that was not already decided to be given. And what he gave it exactly the right moment to produce the right response in the room. He asked exactly the right questions. In the 7th session, Vorheave attempted a tactical insult, delivered in the breath formal register, at a pitch and timing that required specific cultural knowledge to decode. It was subtle, and it was designed to create pressure without providing grounds for an official response. Elias answered it in a breath formal register, perfectly pitched in a way that named what had been done without naming it, addressed it without escalating it, and left Vork with no available countermove that would not require him to either confirm the insult or retreat from it. Faith retreated. He looked at Elias afterward with the expression I had seen on his face when he first entered the room. Except this time, he did not look away quickly. He looked for a moment longer. The way you look when you're updating something in your understanding. The ceasefire was signed at the end of the 4th week. Human calendar date, because Elias's aide had suggested it during the administrative setup, and the conclave coordination team had simply agreed. I noted this. It was a very small thing. It was not a small thing. 3 days later, the conclave held the membership vote. I was in the chamber. I sat in the observer section because I had not moved my seat yet. Old habit, an old position, and I watched the vote total appear. Unanimous. 612 years of recorded conclave history. No species had ever received unanimous acclamation. The Kethvari senior representative had abstained on 17 previous induction votes in 40 years of service. He voted yes. Elias was at the human observer table when the total appeared. He did not stand. He did not turd his team. He sat still for a moment, and then he looked across the chamber, past all the tables and all the centuries of accumulated galactic politics until he found me. He looked at me the same way he had looked at me on our wedding night, like I was something genuinely interesting, like he was still curious. I nodded, the small movement of a diplomat acknowledging a significant moment. He smiled. The honest one. I looked away because I did not know yet how to keep looking, without my composure making a decision I had not cleared it to make. A year is a very specific measurement. Long enough that the person you were at the beginning of it is visible from where you stand at the end. Identifiable but not identical. Short enough that you remember exactly how you felt when you were that person. The particular texture of that version of your understanding. The things you were certain of that you are not certain of now. I know who I was a year ago. I have my notes. 12 pages at 41 days. 17 more at 48. They are accurate. Every observation I recorded is factually correct. The interpretation I built from those observations, the frame, the conclusion I had essentially reached before I began observing. That was where I was wrong. It was the error of someone who decided too quickly and then looked for evidence of what she had already decided. He still wakes before me. There's always coffee on the counter by the time I reach the kitchen, which means he makes it before anything else, which means it is the first deliberate act of his day. I did not notice this for weeks. I noticed the coffee. I did not notice that it was a choice made every morning for me, without announcement or expectation of acknowledgement. When I finally noticed, I started making tea for him on the days he had early briefings. He noticed immediately. He did not say anything about it. He started making sure there was always dried zuzu in the kitchen, because I had mentioned once months ago that I preferred it in my morning tea. I had mentioned it once. We do not comment on most of what we do for each other. It seems to be part of how it works. The language of it does not require words, which is interesting for two people whose professional lives are built entirely on the precise deployment of language. He still shakes hands with everyone, every maintenance worker, every kitchen aide, every junior attest from every delegation who encounters him in corridors. He told me the origin of the gesture one evening when I finally asked, having spent months noting it without asking. He said it began as proof that you were not carrying a weapon, that the open hand, the extended arm, the clasp grip had started as the most basic possible communication of harmlessness. I thought about that for 3 days, about how the proof of harmlessness had become, over centuries, the primary gesture of welcome, how the beginning of the thing and the meaning of the thing had traveled in exactly opposite directions. The breath command insignia is still on my desk. I have not moved it. I thought about moving it several times in the early weeks, when its presence felt like a statement I had not made intentionally. I do not think about moving it anymore. It has become part of the landscape of my workspace, the way everything becomes landscape when it has been present long enough. Not invisible, but located correctly. It is a record of something, not a trophy, a record of the day my understanding of the horizon changed. There is something I have wanted to say for a long time, something I have been approaching in my notes for months, writing around rather than directly. The way you approach something that you're not quite sure you have the right words for yet. I'm going to try to say it now. Every species in the conclave at some point in its development learned to manage attachment. The elder races especially. When your civilization spans generations longer than some species' entire recorded existence. When you have watched enough things end, empires, alliances, relationships, whole ways of life, you learn to hold what you love at a certain distance. You love carefully, strategically, with enough reserve to survive the loss of it. This is called wisdom, in most traditions I have studied, is considered a sign of maturity. Is considered the appropriate response to the knowledge that everything ends. Humans love differently. They love loudly, messily, without reserve, without strategic distance, with full knowledge that what they love can be taken from them. They do not love in spite of the vulnerability. They love toward it as if the fact that something can be lost is the reason to hold it tighter, not the reason to hold it less. I read this pattern in 11 days of engagement logs from the Outer Rim. I heard it in 400 voices saying one name on an open channel in the darkness. I felt that in the moment, Elias sat down on the floor beside me without being asked, because I was on the floor and he did not want me to be there alone. That love is not weakness. It is not naivety. It is not the absence of calculation. It is a different calculation entirely, one whose final factor is large enough to make all other factors function differently. It is the reason 7 ships went against 60 and found a way. It is the reason 61 ships came to a station surrounded by 240 and did not once compute the possibility of leaving. It is the reason a man spent weeks learning my language before he ever met me. and has never once mentioned unprompted. It is the reason the coffee is always on the counter. You cannot build that from strategy. You cannot manufacture it from a doctrine file or a mathematical model. It comes from caring about something so completely that the question of what it costs becomes secondary to the fact of the caring. That is what I did not know a year ago. That is what I have learned. The second ceremony was small. We held it in the garden level of the new human embassy quarters. A room Elias had specifically requested, because it had living plants in it, which the Conclave facilities team had spent 3 weeks sourcing and installing. The plants were blue-green and low to the ground, and smelled faintly of something I could not name. And a light in that room was warm in a specific way that made everything look like it was the beginning of something, rather than the continuation of something. 12 people attended. His closest colleagues, 2 of mine, Oliver Cross, who had written the boarding action report in his careful and slightly shaking prose, stood near the back in formal attire that he clearly found uncomfortable and wore with complete willingness. Petra Hale attended via long-range holographic presence from the Outer Rim settlement because she had been invited and had said she would not miss it. Nora Vale, a human woman who had been in Conclave services for 20 years, performed the ceremony. She did it with the warmth of someone who genuinely believed in the significance of the thing she was doing rather than simply executing a function. When she reached the question, the formal question, the one that closes the form and opens the life, I heard my mother's voice. Not literally, in memory, the specific cadence she uses when she reminds me of something she considers fundamental. You do this for the Empire. I stood in a room with growing things and warm light beside the man who had sat on the floor beside me in the dark, who had put coffee on the counter every morning of the past year, who had learned my language because it seemed useful, and had never used it to impress anyone, who had looked at me on our wedding night like I was something genuinely interesting, and had been looking at me that way every day since. I said, I do. Not for the Empire, not for the Conclave, not for the treaty that brought us to the same room in the first place. For him. For the man who does not retreat. For the man who wakes before me. For the man who made me laugh in the dark after the world had rearranged itself, and who sat on the floor beside me without being asked, and who said, usually breakfast and mint, you are not alone in this, and you will be all right. And there is always a next thing, and I will be in it. The breath command insignia is on my desk. The horizon has moved. It keeps moving. I know now that this is what horizons do. Not because the world is unstable, but because sight expands, and with it, everything previously thought to be an edge. I asked him once, much later, sitting in the garden level with the blue-green plants and the warm light, whether he had known on our wedding night, whether he had looked at me across that reception room and known any part of what was coming. He was quiet in the way he is quiet, when a question deserves a real answer, rather than a fast one. I knew you were worth knowing, he said eventually. I figure the rest would follow. I thought about that. He was right. Of course he was right. He is usually right in that quiet, certain, unhurried way that used to irritate me, and now is simply the sound of him thinking. The rested follow is still following, and I find to my continuing and genuine surprise that I am glad to see where it leads.